The thundering hooves of a lone rider echoed through the dusty plains of Silverhorn, Wyoming, as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountain range. Grace Elliot clutched her worn leather reins tightly, her knuckles whitening with determination as she urged her palomino faster toward the horizon. The year was 1876, and at 26, Grace had already weathered more storms than most souls twice her age. Her late husband's homestead awaited her return, along with the two small children who had been under the care of her elderly neighbor since dawn. The wind whipped through Grace's dark blonde hair as she rode, loose strands escaping from beneath her wide-brimmed hat. 6 months a widow, she still wore Thomas's old shirt with the sleeves rolled up, paired with a practical riding skirt that had seen better days. The memory of her husband's face was beginning to fade like an old photograph left too long in the sun, and that realization haunted her more than his actual passing. As Grace crested the final hill overlooking the modest homestead that Thomas had built with his bare hands, she allowed herself a moment to catch her breath. The small cabin with its smoke curling from the stone chimney looked like a painting against the backdrop of the vast Wyoming wilderness. 2 children played in the yard: Emma, age 7 with pigtails that bounced when she ran, and little James, barely 4, whose laughter carried up the hillside despite the distance. Mrs. Wilkins, a silver-haired widow who lived half a mile east, stood watching them from the porch. Grace raised her hand in greeting, relief washing over her that all was well. She had spent the day in town, seeking work to supplement the meager income from their small cattle herd. With winter approaching, the provisions were running dangerously low. "Mama's back." Emma's voice pierced the evening air as Grace dismounted near the corral. The little girl came running, her brother toddling behind with arms outstretched. Grace swept James into an embrace, kissing his sun-warmed cheek. "Have you been good for Mrs. Wilkins?" "They've been angels," the elderly woman assured, though the twinkle in her eyes suggested otherwise. "That boy of yours found his way into the flour bin while I was fetching water." "James," Grace sighed, tousling his hair affectionately, "what am I going to do with you, Mrs.?" Wilkins gathered her shawl around her shoulders. "I've left some stew on the stove, should still be warm." "You're a blessing, Mrs. Wilkins. I don't know how to repay you." "Nonsense. Thomas would have done the same for Harold when he was alive." She patted Grace's hand. "Any luck in town?" Grace lowered her voice so the children wouldn't hear. "The mercantile needs someone to mind the books 3 days a week. It's not much, but it'll help see us through winter." "You'll manage, dear, you always do," with a nod to the darkening sky, Mrs. Wilkins started down the path toward her own homestead. After tending to her horse, Grace herded her children inside. The cabin was small but tidy, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area and a single bedroom that they all shared. A quilt Thomas's mother had made hung on one wall, the only touch of color in the otherwise austere space. "Hands washed, then to the table," Grace instructed, stoking the fire in the wood stove. Emma dutifully led her brother to the wash basin while Grace set 3 bowls on the rough-hewn table Thomas had crafted during her first pregnancy. "Is there bread?" Emma asked hopefully. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Tomorrow I'll bake." Grace ladled the thick stew into bowls, grateful for Mrs. Wilkins's generosity. The children waited at the table, their eyes reflecting the flickering light of the single oil lamp. Grace set down their supper and said, "Eat before it cools." As they ate in the warm, intimate silence of their cabin, Grace didn't notice the lone rider who paused on the hillside, observing the glowing window of their home before continuing west into the gathering darkness. That rider was Gabriel Evans, a man whose life was about to become intertwined with theirs in ways none of them could imagine. Gabriel had been on the trail for 3 weeks, moving steadily northward from Colorado. At 32, he carried the weight of the past decade in the lines around his eyes and the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the revolver holstered at his hip had only been drawn for hunting during his journey. He had left behind a cattle ranch in Colorado after selling his share to his younger brother. The war had changed him, as it had changed many men, leaving him restless and haunted by memories that no amount of hard work could fully silence. When the letter had arrived from an old Army friend offering him work as foreman on a growing ranch in Wyoming, Gabriel had packed his meager belongings and headed north. The directions had led him to Silverhorn, where he'd learned that his friend's ranch lay another day's ride west. With darkness falling, Gabriel had sought shelter in a stand of cottonwoods near a small stream. From his campsite, he'd caught a glimpse of Grace's cabin with its welcoming light, reminding him of all he'd left behind and the loneliness of the trail. Morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass as Gabriel broke camp. His destination, the Triple R Ranch, belonged to Robert Reynolds, who had served alongside Gabriel in the war. The promise of steady work and purpose drew him forward, yet something about the small homestead he'd passed the night before lingered in his thoughts. Gabriel arrived at the Triple R by midday, received with a hearty handshake from Robert and a hot meal from his wife, Sarah. The ranch was impressive 5,000 acres with a growing herd of cattle and a dozen hands to manage it all. "You're looking at the future of Wyoming territory," Robert declared, sweeping his arm across the vista from the ranch house porch. "With the railroad pushing west and more settlers arriving every month, beef prices are only going up." "It's a fine operation," Gabriel agreed, though his thoughts were still distracted by the memory of the small cabin and its solitary light. "There's a bunkhouse for the hands, but you'll take the foreman's cabin," Robert continued. "It's just past the barn, nothing fancy, but it's private." Gabriel nodded appreciatively. "When do you want me to start?" "Tomorrow soon enough. Get settled today." "Sarah's put together some supplies for your cabin." The foreman's cabin was indeed modest, a single room with a bed, table, and wood stove, but it was more than Gabriel had expected, and certainly more than he'd had on the trail. As he unpacked his saddlebags, he discovered a small Bible that had belonged to his mother. He placed it on the table, a reminder of the faith she had tried to instill in him before consumption had taken her when he was just 16. The following days were filled with hard work as Gabriel learned the rhythms of the Triple R. He rose before dawn, organized the day's tasks for the ranch hands, rode the boundaries checking fences, and assisted with the countless chores that kept a large ranch functioning. Robert was a fair boss, and the men respected Gabriel's quiet competence and military background. It was nearly 2 weeks later when Gabriel rode into Silverhorn for supplies. The town was small but growing, with a main street that boasted a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a newly constructed schoolhouse. He tethered his horse outside the mercantile and stepped into the dim interior, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. "Be right with you," called a female voice from the back of the store. Gabriel removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair as he waited. When Grace emerged from behind a curtain that separated the storeroom from the shop floor, he felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. "You're from the homestead east of town," he said before he could stop himself. Grace looked up, startled. Her blue eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the stranger. "I am. Have we met?" "No, madam. I passed by your place my first night in the territory, saw the light in your window." Gabriel felt foolish admitting he'd noticed such a detail. "I see." Grace's tone was cautious but not unfriendly. "Are you settling in the area?" Working as foreman at the Triple R, Gabriel Evans, he introduced himself, extending his hand across the counter. "Grace Elliot." Her handshake was firm, her palm calloused from work. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Evans?" Gabriel produced the list Robert had given him. As Grace gathered the items, he noted the simple gold band she still wore on her left hand and the tired shadows beneath her eyes. "A woman carrying too much alone," he thought. "You have children?" he asked, remembering the small figures he'd glimpsed in the yard. Grace's expression softened. "2. Emma is 7 and James is 4, fine ages." Gabriel's voice held genuine warmth. "My sister back in Colorado has 4 little ones. You've come a long way." Grace wrapped the purchases in brown paper, needed a change. Gabriel didn't elaborate and Grace didn't press. As she tallied the items, Gabriel noticed a sign in the window advertising a barn raising for that Saturday at the Peterson place. "Will you be at the raising?" he asked, paying for the supplies. Yes, we'll be there. The community helps each other in these parts. Grace handed him his change. Will the Triple R be sending men? Robert mentioned it. I expect I'll be there. Gabriel gathered his parcels. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Elliot. Likewise, Mr. Evans. Grace's smile was polite but reserved as she watched him leave. On the ride back to the ranch, Gabriel couldn't shake the image of Grace's tired eyes and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. There was a story there, as there was with most who ventured west seeking a new beginning or escaping an old life. He wondered which it had been for the Elliots, and what had left Grace alone with two young children in such unforgiving country. Saturday arrived with perfect weather for a barn raising. The Peterson homestead was alive with activity as wagons and riders arrived from throughout the region. Men in shirt sleeves conferred over plans while women organized food tables under canvas awnings. Children darted between adults, their excited voices adding to the festive atmosphere. Gabriel rode in with Robert and 6 ranch hands, all eager to lend muscle to the work and sample the promised feast afterward. As they dismounted, Gabriel scanned the gathering, his gaze finding Grace almost immediately. She stood with a group of women, a basket over her arm, her blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a simple bonnet. Emma clung to her skirts while James sat perched on a nearby wagon, swinging his legs and watching the men with undisguised fascination. Robert noticed Gabriel's distraction. You know the widow Elliot, met her at the mercantile. She works there, 3 days a week, from what Sarah tells me. Thomas Elliot was a good man, had that small spread east of town. Fever took him last winter. Robert shook his head. Tough break for a woman with young ones. Before Gabriel could respond, they were called to join the men gathering lumber. The work was hard but satisfying, with the frame of the barn rising steadily as the morning progressed. By midday, the skeleton of what would become a sturdy structure stood outlined against the clear blue sky. The women called everyone to the dinner tables, laden with fried chicken, beans, cornbread, and pies of every description. Gabriel found himself in line behind Grace and her children. Your boy seems interested in the building, he observed, nodding toward James, who was still watching the barn frame with wide-eyed wonder. He wants to be a carpenter like his father was, Grace replied, helping Emma fill her plate. Thomas built our cabin himself. He did a fine job. It looked solid, Gabriel said, then added, from what I could see as I passed by. Grace gave him a curious look. You noticed a lot for someone just passing through in the dark. Gabriel felt heat rise in his face. I spent years in the cavalry. Noticing details becomes habit. The war. Grace asked quietly. Yes, madam. Rode with the 4th Colorado. Understanding crossed her features. Thomas was with the 2nd Kansas. He didn't talk about it much. They reached the end of the food table, and Gabriel thought their conversation would end, but Grace hesitated. Would you care to join us, Mr. Evans? James has been full of questions about barn building that I can't answer. Surprised and pleased by the invitation, Gabriel nodded. I'd be honored. They settled at a table under a cottonwood, James immediately peppering Gabriel with questions about the barn. Gabriel answered patiently, explaining how the beams fit together and why certain woods were chosen for different parts. Emma remained shy, studying Gabriel from beneath her lashes until he asked about her doll, which she clutched protectively. Her name is Margaret, Emma finally volunteered. Papa made her before he went to heaven. She's beautiful, Gabriel said sincerely, noting the hand-carved wooden face and carefully stitched dress. Your papa must have been very talented. He could make anything, Emma declared proudly. Grace watched the interaction with guarded interest. Since Thomas's death, she had kept to herself, focusing on survival and her children's well-being. Male attention was something she neither sought nor encouraged, yet there was something about Gabriel Evans that put her at ease. Perhaps it was the patient way he spoke to James, or the respect in his voice when he mentioned Thomas's craftsmanship. How are you finding the Triple R? She asked when the children's attention turned to their dessert. It's good work. Robert runs a tight operation. Gabriel sipped his coffee. But I imagine it's quite different from your homestead. The quiet suits us, Grace said simply. Though sometimes the work is more than one person can manage, if you ever need an extra pair of hands. Gabriel left the offer unfinished. Grace's expression turned carefully neutral. That's kind, but we manage, of course. Gabriel recognized the pride in her response. Just a neighborly offer. The afternoon continued with more work on the barn, the men now raising the heavy rafters that would support the roof. Grace gathered her children to head home before sunset, stopping to thank Gabriel for his company. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Elliot," he said, tipping his hat. "Perhaps I'll see you in town." "Perhaps." Grace's smile was genuine if still reserved. "Good day, Mr. Evans." As she drove their wagon away, James waved enthusiastically from the back. Gabriel returned the wave, a curious sense of loss accompanying their departure. Robert appeared at his side. The widow's got her hands full with that place and two little ones. "She seems capable," Gabriel remarked, his eyes still following the wagon. "Capable, yes, but even the strongest need help sometimes." Robert gave him a knowing look. "Sarah's been concerned about them with winter coming." Gabriel merely nodded, returning to the work at hand, but his thoughts remained with Grace and her children as the afternoon waned into evening. The following weeks brought the first hint of winter to Wyoming. The mornings dawned frosty, with thin ice forming along creek edges and cattle huddling for warmth in the lee of hillsides. Gabriel settled into his role at the Triple R, earning the respect of the ranch hands and Robert's increasing trust. His duties occasionally took him into Silverhorn, where he made a point of stopping at the mercantile when he knew Grace would be working. Their conversations were brief, but gradually warmed as Grace's initial wariness eased. She spoke of Emma's progress in the new schoolhouse and James's latest mischief, while Gabriel shared stories of life on the ranch and occasionally news from the wider world gleaned from month-old newspapers that made their way to Wyoming. It was during one such visit in early November that Grace appeared particularly tired, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes despite her attempt at a cheerful demeanor. "Are you well, Mrs. Elliot?" Gabriel asked as she wrapped his purchases. "Just a bit overworked," Grace admitted. "The roof began leaking during the last rain, and I haven't had time to properly repair it." Gabriel didn't hesitate. "I have Sunday free. I could take a look if you'd allow it." Grace's instinct was to refuse, as she had refused similar offers of help in the past. But the thought of another cold night with water dripping into pots placed strategically around the cabin floor weakened her resolve. "I would be grateful," she said finally, "but I insist on feeding you a proper meal in return. That sounds more than fair." Gabriel smiled, pleased she had accepted. "I'll ride over after church." Sunday afternoon found Gabriel approaching the Elliot homestead with tools and materials strapped to his saddle. The day was clear but cold, his breath visible in the air as he rode. The property looked different in daylight than it had that night he'd passed by, smaller and more vulnerable than he remembered, but neatly kept despite the obvious signs of Thomas Elliot's absence. A split-rail fence enclosed a kitchen garden, now mostly dormant for the season, and a small corral held a sturdy mule and an aging milk cow. The cabin itself was constructed of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney, simple but solid. A few chickens scratched in the yard, and a clothesline held linens flapping in the brisk wind. Emma spotted him first, running to the cabin door to announce his arrival. Grace emerged, wiping her hands on her apron, with James peering curiously around her skirts. She wore her hair in a simple braid down her back, and her Sunday dress, though well-worn, complemented the blue of her eyes. "Mr. Evans," she greeted him. "Thank you for coming." Gabriel dismounted, leading his horse to the hitching post. "Happy to help, Mrs. Elliot." "Show me where that roof's giving you trouble." Grace pointed out the problematic corner of the cabin, where water had stained the interior ceiling. Gabriel examined it critically, then retrieved his tools and a bundle of shingles he'd brought from the ranch. "It's not too bad," he assessed. "Should be fixed before sundown." While Gabriel worked on the roof, Grace continued preparing the Sunday meal. Through the open window, she could hear him speaking with James, who had appointed himself helper and handed up nails from a safe position on the ground. Emma, initially shy around their visitor, gradually warmed to his presence and joined her brother in the yard. Grace found herself listening for Gabriel's deep voice and occasional laugh as he interacted with her children. Thomas had been gone nearly a year now, and in that time, no man had shown such natural ease with Emma and James. Most of the unmarried men in the area viewed a widow with 2 young children as a burden, while the married couples offered sympathy but had their own families to tend. By late afternoon, Gabriel descended from the roof, satisfied with his repairs. "That should hold through winter and beyond," he announced, brushing dust from his clothes. "I noticed your woodpile's running low. Would you mind if I split some before I leave?" "You've done more than enough," Grace protested, but Gabriel was already rolling up his sleeves. "The work keeps me warm," he insisted, heading for the chopping block. The rhythmic sound of axe striking wood filled the air as Grace put the finishing touches on their meal, a rabbit stew with the last vegetables from her garden, cornbread baked in the cast iron skillet, and an apple pie made with fruit traded for her labor at the Peterson orchard. The children watched in fascination as Gabriel's powerful strokes reduced logs to manageable pieces. When he finally set aside the axe, the woodpile had tripled in size, enough to last through several weeks of cold weather. "You'll stay for supper now," Grace said, making it more statement than question as she called them inside. The cabin's interior was warm and fragrant with cooking smells. Though simply furnished, it bore touches of Grace's care: a vase of dried wildflowers on the table, a patchwork quilt folded over the back of the single rocking chair, children's drawings pinned to one wall. The children waited at the table while Grace set down supper and said, "Eat before it cools." It was such a simple, domestic moment, a mother feeding her children, the day's work complete, yet Gabriel felt a tightness in his chest as he watched. How long had it been since he'd sat at a family table? Not since leaving his brother's home in Colorado, and even then, it hadn't felt like this. Grace said a brief blessing, and they ate by the light of oil lamps as twilight descended outside. The conversation flowed more easily than Gabriel expected, with Emma eventually overcoming her shyness to tell him about school, and James proudly describing how he helped his mama with the chickens. "This is delicious," Gabriel complimented Grace. "Best meal I've had since coming to Wyoming." "High praise considering Mrs. Reynolds's reputation as a cook," Grace replied with a small smile. "Sarah's skilled, but there's something about a meal earned by honest work that improves the taste." After supper, Gabriel insisted on helping with the washing up while the children prepared for bed. They worked side by side at the wash basin, and Gabriel was acutely aware of Grace's presence: the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, the strand of blonde hair that had escaped her braid, the capable movement of her hands as she dried each dish. "Why did you really offer to help today?" Grace asked suddenly, her voice low so the children wouldn't hear from the bedroom. Gabriel considered his answer carefully. "Because you needed it and I was able. No more complicated than that. Most men want something in return." "I'm not most men, Mrs. Elliot." Gabriel met her gaze steadily. "And I already got something in return: good company and a fine meal." Grace studied him for a long moment. "No, I don't believe you are like most men, Mr. Evans." When the dishes were done and the children tucked into bed, Gabriel knew it was time to leave. At the door, he put on his hat and coat, aware of the cold night waiting outside and reluctant to leave the warmth of the cabin. "Thank you for the meal," he said, suddenly awkward, "and for allowing me to help. It seems I'm the one who should be thanking you." Grace stood in the doorway, the lamplight behind her creating a halo effect around her figure. "The roof and the wood, you've saved me days of work. If you need anything else," Gabriel began. "I know where to find you," Grace finished for him. "Good night, Mr. Evans." "Gabriel," he said impulsively. "My friends call me Gabriel." A smile touched her lips. "Good night then, Gabriel." "Good night, Grace," he replied, her given name feeling right on his tongue. He mounted his horse and rode into the darkness, looking back once to see her silhouette still in the doorway, a beacon of light against the black Wyoming night. The weeks leading to Christmas brought increasing cold and the first heavy snows of winter. Gabriel's duties at the Triple R kept him busy from dawn to dusk, but his thoughts often strayed to the small cabin east of town and its occupants. He managed 2 more visits to the mercantile when Grace was working, brief encounters that left him wanting more time in her company. It was during the second visit that Grace mentioned the upcoming Christmas social at the schoolhouse. "Emma's quite excited," she said as she measured coffee beans into a paper sack. "She has a small part in the children's pageant." "Will you be attending?" Gabriel asked, trying to sound casual. "Of course, it's the highlight of the season for the children." Grace tied the sack with string. "Will the Triple R be represented? Robert and Sarah always go. I expect I'll accompany them." Gabriel hesitated, then added, "Perhaps I could escort you and the children." "The nights are dark, and the trail can be treacherous in snow." Grace looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "That's very considerate, but I wouldn't want to take you out of your way." "It's no trouble. The schoolhouse is between our properties." When Grace still appeared uncertain, Gabriel added, "Consider it a Christmas kindness." "Very well," she conceded. "Thank you." The night of the social arrived clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky as Gabriel rode toward the Elliot homestead. He'd taken extra care with his appearance, wearing his good coat and a freshly ironed shirt borrowed from one of the ranch hands. His normally unruly hair was slicked back with pomade, and he'd splashed precious cologne on his freshly shaved face. The cabin glowed with welcoming light as he approached. Gabriel dismounted and knocked on the door, stamping snow from his boots. When Grace opened it, he momentarily lost the ability to speak. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, deep green wool that complemented her fair coloring. Her hair was arranged in a more elaborate style than usual, with soft curls framing her face. A small pendant, perhaps a locket, hung at her throat. "You look beautiful," he said before he could censor himself. A blush colored Grace's cheeks. "Thank you. Please come in while we finish getting ready." The children were dressed in their Sunday best, excitement making their eyes shine. Emma wore a red ribbon in her hair, while James sported a small bow tie that he kept tugging at until Grace gently stopped his hand. "We're so pleased Mr. Evans is taking us to the social," Grace told the children as she helped them with their coats. "What do we say?" "Thank you, Mr. Evans," they chorused. "It's my pleasure," Gabriel replied with a smile. "I hear Miss Emma has an important role in the pageant." Emma nodded seriously. "I'm an angel. I have real wings that Mrs. Peterson made from goose feathers." "I'm sure you'll be the finest angel Wyoming has ever seen," Gabriel assured her, earning a shy smile in return. They traveled to the schoolhouse in Gabriel's borrowed wagon, the children tucked between blankets in the back while Grace sat beside Gabriel on the seat. The night was bitterly cold but still, their breath forming clouds that caught the moonlight. Gabriel was acutely aware of Grace's proximity, the occasional brush of her arm against his as the wagon jostled over the snow-covered trail. "Thank you for this," Grace said quietly. "It's been difficult managing everything alone." "You don't have to always manage alone," Gabriel replied, his voice equally soft. Before Grace could respond, they arrived at the schoolhouse. The simple building was transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorating the entrance. Light spilled from every window, and the sound of a fiddle playing Silent Night drifted into the night air. Inside, the schoolroom had been cleared of desks, with benches arranged around the perimeter and a small stage erected at one end. A tall spruce tree stood in one corner, adorned with paper chains, popcorn strings, and small carved ornaments. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Emma quickly spotted her teacher and hurried off to prepare for the pageant, while James remained close to Grace, overwhelmed by the crowd and noise. Gabriel felt a small hand slip into his and looked down to see James gazing up at him with solemn eyes. "It's loud," the boy explained. "It is," Gabriel agreed, giving the small hand a reassuring squeeze. "Shall we find a quiet corner until the pageant starts?" James nodded, and Gabriel led him to a less crowded area, Grace following with a grateful smile. They found seats on a bench against the wall, James between them, as neighbors stopped to greet Grace and curiously assess her companion. Gabriel met the scrutiny with polite nods, aware that his presence at Grace's side was causing quiet speculation. Small communities thrived on such observations, and a widow being escorted by an unmarried man was noteworthy indeed. The pageant began with the youngest children singing carols, followed by a recitation of the Christmas story by older students. Emma appeared as part of the heavenly host, her goose feather wings slightly askew but her expression so earnestly solemn that Gabriel found himself moved by the simple performance. "Your angel is doing splendidly," he whispered to Grace, who watched with shining eyes. "Thomas would be so proud," she whispered back, her voice catching. Impulsively, Gabriel covered her hand with his own. Grace tensed momentarily but didn't pull away, allowing the contact as they watched the remainder of the pageant. After the performance, refreshments were served: cider, cookies, and cakes contributed by the women of the community. James overcame his shyness enough to join the other small boys in a game of marbles in one corner, while Emma basked in compliments on her angelic performance. "Mrs. Elliot," a woman's voice called, and Grace turned to see Sarah Reynolds approaching with a platter of gingerbread. "Your Emma was wonderful, and I see you've met our foreman." "Yes, Mr. Evans has been kind enough to escort us tonight," Grace replied. "How lovely," Sarah's eyes twinkled knowingly between them. "Gabriel is quite the catch, you know. Half the single ladies in the county have set their caps for him." "Mrs. Reynolds," Gabriel protested, feeling his face warm. "Oh, don't be modest," Sarah teased, then lowered her voice conspiratorially to Grace. "He turned down dinner with the banker's daughter last week. Pretty thing too, but apparently not to his taste." "Sarah, I believe Robert is looking for you," Gabriel said desperately, spotting his employer across the room. "Is he? Well, I'll leave you two to enjoy the evening." Sarah moved away with a meaningful glance over her shoulder. "I apologize for that," Gabriel said once she was out of earshot. "Sarah has taken it upon herself to see everyone happily matched." "No need to apologize," Grace replied, amusement in her eyes. "It's flattering to be considered competition for the banker's daughter." The tension broken, they shared a smile that felt like a private understanding. The evening continued pleasantly, with dancing added to the festivities as the fiddle player was joined by a man with a harmonica. Gabriel hesitated, then offered his hand to Grace. "Would you care to dance?" Grace glanced at the children, but Sarah had already swooped in, offering to watch them. "It seems I'm free to accept," she said, placing her hand in Gabriel's. He led her to where other couples circled the room to a lively rendition of Buffalo Gals. Gabriel was no expert dancer, but years of military discipline had given him a sense of rhythm, and Grace followed his lead gracefully. They moved together with surprising ease, as if their bodies recognized a natural harmony that their minds were still discovering. "I haven't danced since before Thomas fell ill," Grace admitted as they turned. "I'm honored you chose to break that fast with me," Gabriel replied. As the evening drew to a close, families began gathering their sleepy children and bidding farewell. Gabriel collected James, who had nodded off on a bench, and carried him to the wagon while Grace took Emma's hand. The return journey was quiet, both children asleep within minutes of leaving the schoolhouse. When they reached the Elliot cabin, Gabriel carried James inside while Grace led a drowsy Emma. They tucked the children into their bed with practiced movements that felt strangely domestic, as if they had performed this ritual together countless times before. In the main room, Gabriel lingered by the door, reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for allowing me to accompany you tonight." "It was the most enjoyable evening I've had in a very long time," Grace replied softly, standing close enough that he could see the reflection of the lamp flame in her eyes. "The children adore you, you know. They're wonderful children. You've done an admirable job raising them alone. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by them. A boy needs a father's guidance." Grace's gaze dropped to her hands where she still wore Thomas's ring. "You're giving them everything they need," Gabriel assured her. "Love, security, strength, not everything." Grace looked up, something vulnerable and honest in her expression. "There are some things I can't provide alone." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibility. Gabriel took a half step closer, drawn by forces he couldn't name. "Grace," a sound from the children's bedroom broke the moment. Emma called out in her sleep, and Grace stepped back, the spell broken. "I should go," Gabriel said, reaching for his hat. "Will you be at the Mercantile this week?" "Wednesday and Friday," Grace replied. "Gabriel, thank you again for tonight. He nodded, settling his hat on his head. Good night, Grace. As he rode back to the Triple R through the cold, clear night, Gabriel knew with sudden clarity that he was falling in love with Grace Elliot. The realization should have frightened him. He had sworn after the war to avoid entanglements, to keep moving rather than put down roots. Yet instead of fear, he felt something akin to peace, as if a piece of himself long missing had finally been found. Christmas arrived with a blizzard that kept everyone close to home. Gabriel thought of Grace and the children in their small cabin, hoping they were warm and had enough supplies. When the storm finally broke on December 27th, he saddled his horse despite the bitter cold and rode to the Mercantile in Silverhorn. The store was nearly empty, most folks still digging out from the storm. Grace looked up in surprise when Gabriel entered, snow still clinging to his coat. Gabriel. I didn't expect to see anyone today. I wanted to bring these, he explained, producing a small package from inside his coat. Christmas gifts for the children. Nothing elaborate, a carved horse for James and a hair ribbon for Emma. Grace accepted the package with visible emotion. That's very thoughtful. They'll be delighted. She hesitated, then reached beneath the counter. I have something for you as well. She handed him a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Gabriel unwrapped it to find a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. I made it during the evenings, Grace explained, a hint of color in her cheeks. I noticed your old one was rather worn. Gabriel ran his fingers over the soft wool. It's perfect, thank you. Their eyes met across the counter, and the connection that had begun to form at the Christmas social strengthened. In that moment, Gabriel knew he couldn't wait any longer to express what he was feeling. Grace, would you allow me to call on you properly? Not as a neighbor helping out, but as a man interested in courting a woman he greatly admires. Grace's eyes widened at his directness. Gabriel, I have the children to consider. I know, they're part of why I admire you so much. You're an extraordinary mother. He leaned forward slightly. I would never ask you to choose between them and me. I'm asking for a chance to be part of all your lives. Grace was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. It's been only a year since Thomas died. I'm not certain I'm ready. I understand, Gabriel said, trying to mask his disappointment. The offer remains open whenever you might feel ready. He turned to leave, the new scarf clutched in his hand when Grace's voice stopped him. Gabriel, wait. She came around the counter to stand before him. I'm not saying no. I'm asking for time. Hope rekindled in his chest. Time I can give. Winter deepened, and Gabriel respected Grace's request for space while still finding reasons to check on the family. He repaired a broken hinge on their barn door, delivered a sack of sugar when he heard the Mercantile's shipment had been delayed, and once, during another storm, rode through blinding snow to make sure they had enough firewood. Each visit strengthened the bond between them, with Gabriel taking care to engage the children as much as Grace. He taught James to whittle simple shapes from wood scraps and listened patiently to Emma's reading from her primer. Grace watched these interactions with growing warmth, her initial reservations slowly melting. By February, the citizens of Silverhorn had come to expect Gabriel's presence at the Elliot homestead on Sundays after church. Gossip flourished but remained generally good-natured, especially after Sarah Reynolds made it known that she wholeheartedly approved of the match. It was on a Sunday in late February, as Gabriel prepared to leave after supper, that Grace finally gave him the answer he'd been hoping for. The children had been put to bed and they stood alone by the door, the cabin quiet except for the crackling of the fire. I've been thinking about what you asked at Christmas, Grace said, her voice soft but steady. About courting. Gabriel's heart quickened. And I believe I'm ready to accept if the offer still stands. It does. Gabriel took her hand gently. It most certainly does. Grace's fingers tightened around his. The children are fond of you and she took a deep breath. I find myself thinking of you when you're not here. That hasn't happened since Thomas. I think of you constantly, Gabriel admitted. Of all of you, this cabin feels more like home to me than my quarters at the ranch. Grace's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. Thomas would want us to be happy, I believe that now. I want to make you happy, Grace, all of you. With careful reverence, Gabriel leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a a promise rather than a demand, and Grace responded with similar tenderness. When they parted, something had shifted between them, a threshold crossed from which neither wished to return. Spring came to Wyoming with its usual capriciousness, warm days followed by sudden snowfalls, muddy trails that froze overnight, and the first tender green shoots appearing in protected hollows. Gabriel's courtship of Grace progressed steadily through the changing season, with Sunday visits becoming more frequent evening calls as the days lengthened. The children accepted his presence with increasing naturalness. James began to watch for Gabriel's arrival, running to meet his horse whenever he appeared on the trail. Emma, more reserved by nature, showed her acceptance by sharing her treasured books and asking his opinion on her schoolwork. By April, Gabriel had become such a fixture in their lives that the transition to the next step seemed inevitable. On a particularly fine Sunday, with the fruit trees in blossom and meadowlarks singing from fence posts, Gabriel asked Grace to walk with him after dinner. They strolled to a small rise behind the cabin that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. The land was coming alive after winter's dormancy, paintbrush and lupine adding splashes of color to the awakening grassland. "I've been thinking about the future," Gabriel began, his hand finding hers as they stood side by side. "What about it?" Grace asked, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested she anticipated his direction. "I love you, Grace. I love your children. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Gabriel turned to face her fully. "Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes, Gabriel. Yes, I will." He gathered her into his arms, his kiss deeper and more passionate than the careful exchanges they had shared before. Grace responded with equal fervor, her body molding against his, as if finally allowed to express the desire that had been building between them. When they returned to the cabin, flushed and smiling, the children looked up curiously from their play. "Children," Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident on her face, "Mr. Evans has asked me to marry him and I've said yes. He's going to be part of our family now." Emma and James stared at them for a moment, absorbing the news. Then James broke into a wide grin. "Will you live here with us? Will you teach me to ride a real horse?" Gabriel laughed, relief washing through him at the boy's enthusiasm. "Yes to both questions, partner." Emma approached more cautiously. "Will you be our papa now?" she asked, her young face serious. Gabriel knelt to meet her at eye level. "I would be honored to be your papa, Emma, but I know your father was a fine man who loved you very much. I won't try to replace him in your heart. There's room for both of us there, don't you think?" Emma considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Papa would like you. He always said Mama shouldn't be alone." Grace made a soft sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, as she gathered her daughter into an embrace. Gabriel included James in the circle of his arms, and for a moment, they stood together as the family they were becoming. The wedding took place in early June, when the prairie was at its most beautiful. The ceremony was held in the small church in Silverhorn, with Robert standing as Gabriel's best man and Sarah attending Grace. Emma and James participated proudly, the boy carrying the rings on a small cushion while Emma scattered wildflower petals down the aisle. Grace wore a new dress of pale blue silk ordered specially from Denver, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Gabriel, in a new suit that made him look both distinguished and slightly uncomfortable, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on the arm of the elderly minister who had agreed to give her away. The vows were traditional but spoken with profound sincerity. When Gabriel promised to love, honor, and cherish Grace until death parted them, his voice rang with conviction that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers in attendance. Grace's response was equally heartfelt, her hand steady in his as they pledged their lives to one another. The celebration afterward was held at the Triple R, with tables set up in the yard and musicians playing well into the evening. The entire community turned out to wish them well, bringing gifts and dishes to share in the feast. As twilight descended, Gabriel found a moment alone with his new wife. They stood on the porch of the main house, watching lanterns being lit in the yard where dancing had begun. "Are you happy, Mrs. Evans?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace, though I still can't quite believe this is real. It's very real, Gabriel assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. And it's just the beginning. Later that night, after the children had been settled in the Evans homestead with Sarah Reynolds watching over them, Gabriel carried his bride across the threshold of the foreman's cabin at the Triple R. They had decided to spend their wedding night there, away from curious little eyes, before returning to the family cabin the following day. The small space had been transformed with fresh linens, flowers, and candles Sarah's doing, Grace suspected. Gabriel set her gently on her feet, suddenly looking as nervous as a boy despite his 33 years. I've waited so long for this, he said softly, reaching to unpin her hair. The blonde tresses fell around her shoulders, catching the candlelight. As have I, Grace admitted, her hands going to the buttons of his waistcoat. Though I find myself unexpectedly shy, Gabriel smiled tenderly. We have all night, there's no hurry. Their lovemaking was sweet and passionate, a physical expression of the love that had grown between them over the months of courtship. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, Grace rested her head on Gabriel's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. What are you thinking? He murmured, stroking her hair. That life takes unexpected turns, Grace replied. A year ago, I couldn't imagine being happy again. Now I can't imagine being anywhere but here with you. Gabriel tightened his arms around her. I rode into Wyoming territory looking for work, not knowing I would find a family. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the first night of their married life closing like a perfect chapter in a story still being written. The following day, they returned to the Elliot, now Evans homestead, where the children greeted them with excitement and 1,000 questions about the celebration. Life quickly settled into new rhythms, with Gabriel dividing his time between his duties at the Triple R and the needs of his instant family. As summer progressed, Gabriel began construction on an addition to the cabin, 2 new rooms that would give them more space as a family. Grace discovered she was expecting their first child together, news that brought joy to all of them, especially when Emma and James understood they would have a new brother or sister by winter's end. Gabriel threw himself into preparations, expanding the garden, increasing their small herd of cattle, and ensuring the homestead was secure against the coming winter. His love for Grace deepened as he watched her body change with the growing child, while his devotion to Emma and James only strengthened as they began to call him Papa with increasing naturalness. By December, the cabin addition was complete, providing a separate bedroom for the children and a small parlor for family gatherings. The original main room remained their kitchen and dining area, while the bedroom Gabriel and Grace now shared had been freshened with new curtains and a larger bed he had crafted himself. It was in this home, on a snowy evening just before Christmas, that their daughter was born. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Sarah Reynolds attending as midwife and the children waiting anxiously in the new parlor with Robert. When the first cry pierced the night, Gabriel, who had remained steadfastly by Grace's side throughout, felt tears stream down his face. Sarah placed the squirming infant in Grace's arms, and Gabriel gathered his exhausted wife and newborn daughter close, overwhelmed by love for both. She's perfect, he whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. Just like her mother, Teresa, Grace said softly, after my grandmother. Teresa Evans. A beautiful name for a beautiful girl. Gabriel kissed Grace's damp forehead. Thank you for this gift. When Emma and James were allowed to enter, their awe at their tiny sister was evident in their wide eyes and careful movements. James reached out a hesitant finger to touch the baby's hand, gasping in delight when she reflexively grasped it. She's so small, Emma marveled. Was I that small? Just about, Grace confirmed with a tired smile, but you grew strong and tall as Teresa will. The family gathered around the bed, a perfect tableau of the life Gabriel and Grace had built together. From the darkest moments of Grace's widowhood had emerged this new beginning, a love story neither had expected to find. 5 years later, the Evans homestead had expanded into a prosperous small ranch. Gabriel had eventually left his position at the Triple R to focus on their own growing operation, applying the knowledge he had gained under Robert's guidance. Grace continued to work part-time at the mercantile, now as bookkeeper rather than clerk, a position that allowed her to bring baby Teresa and later their son, Samuel, with her. Emma, at 12, had grown into a thoughtful young lady who excelled at school and helped care for her younger siblings with natural grace. James, 9 and full of energy, was his father's shadow, learning the business of ranching with enthusiasm. Teresa, 5 and precocious, kept them all entertained with her stories and songs, while Samuel, not quite 2, toddled determinedly after his older brother. On a warm evening in late summer, the family gathered around their table for supper. The room was filled with the comforting aromas of fresh bread and beef stew, the windows open to catch the evening breeze. Gabriel sat at the head of the table, surveying his family with quiet pride as Grace brought the pot to the table. The children waited patiently, a skill hard won through years of gentle instruction. Grace set down their supper and said, as she had that first night Gabriel had glimpsed through their window, "Eat before it cools." As they began passing plates and breaking bread, Gabriel caught Grace's eye across the table. The love that passed between them in that glance spoke of all they had overcome and all they had built together, a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky above their home. Outside, the sun set over the prairie they had tamed together, casting golden light across the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved partners. Inside, surrounded by the family they had created, Gabriel and Grace Evans knew the greatest truth of the frontier, that the most valuable claim was not gold or land, but the love found unexpectedly along the trail of life.